If you're seeing my face, it must mean that it's time again for the SMC Journal podcast, the show that's all about software engineering in today's modern IT, making software better, faster, and more secure. We talk about performance, testing, tuning, security, observability, and all kinds of other really cool stuff on this show. I'm Scott Moore, your host, and I really appreciate you watching today. Your budget, is it under control? Well, I'm not talking about your financial budget. I'm talking about your performance budget, the budget that you set aside and a strategy that you create around your web application to make sure that you're getting the most bang for the buck. Is it as efficient as possible? Are you aware of the amount of resources that web page is actually taking up and how many calls it's making to who? And how do you actually look at metrics that would help you understand how well you're within a budget and keeping things as efficient as possible? Because the more efficient the website is, the better conversions you're going to have. If you're selling something online, the happier your customers are going to be that access the content or the material that they're trying to. And you're trying to reach a whole planet here. It's not just about maybe a couple of countries that have really high bandwidth. You got to think about everybody and their connection speeds, right? So that's what we're going to talk about today is performance budgets. Before we do, let's talk about the sponsor that makes this episode possible. This podcast is sponsored by Saltworks Security. For almost 10 years, Saltworks has delivered world-class application security services and products designed to help enterprises secure their applications from policy to production in an ever-changing security landscape. They're the makers of SaltMiner, an application security management platform designed by security professionals for security professionals. SaltMiner aggregates and normalizes the issues found by many different solutions and enriches that data with business context. SaltMiner gives team members from the C-suite, security, and development teams the ability to manage their application security program through customizable views. The Saltworks SaltMiner Community Edition is a free penetration testing management and delivery application. It provides teams with custom reporting for potentially thousands of end users, red team support, and the ability to manage new and retesting of engagements. SaltMiner Community Edition also allows teams to enforce both testing methodologies and custom vulnerability databases for consistency in engagement delivery. Check them out today at saltworks.io. So someone who has been talking about performance budgets for at least a decade that I know of is Tammy Everts. I've been wanting to have her on the show for a long time. Super happy to present an interview here with her talking about this very topic. How do we set a performance budget? What are the metrics we need to look at? And what are the benefits of doing so? Let's bring on Tammy. Hi, Tammy. Welcome to the SMC Journal podcast. Very excited to have you on the program today.
Thanks, Scott. It's really awesome to be here.
Well, I have been reading and watching some of your presentations for years now, and I'm so happy to have you on the show. I wish I had had you on before now. I've been reading about the things, the big topic that you've been talking about for so long has been around performance budgets, and I'd like for people to learn about that today. I want people to find out about you as well. So could you introduce yourself to our audience and how you kind of got involved in the whole dark art of performance engineering?
Yeah, happy to. So I got involved in performance probably, I want to say 13, 14 years ago. I've been saying more than 10 years for a while now, so I feel like I need to actually lock down a number. And my background is actually in usability and usability studies. I'm not a developer or an engineer. I'm like extreme front end. And how I became interested in performance was just actually thinking for the first time 14 years ago about the fact that site speed is a usability issue. And at the time, it was such a novel idea and I think it was sort of when web performance was just starting to kind of become a known thing through things like, the O'Reilly Velocity Conference, which was, I think, started in 2008, 2009. So yeah, like it was just obvious. It seemed like an obvious crossover or connection to usability that had been sort of sitting out there all along, and sort of came to my attention. And as soon as I started reading some early case studies, research that was sort of expressing this idea that the speed of with which people perceived a page to render actually affected their behavior, their emotions, and ultimately business outcomes, bounce rate and conversions and things like that. I was completely hooked. So that's sort of been my focus ever since. It's been a really very interesting journey over the past 14 years, just sort of watching the industry change and the metrics change, and just how everything's evolved since then.
When we talk about performance budgets, I know what you mean, you know what you mean, but somebody who's never heard of that before is going, okay, is this something about financial or what is this? Can you just at the basic level talk about what a performance budget is?
Yeah, it's a performance budget is it's not a new concept. It's been around for a few years now. Steve Souders, who I work with here at SpeedCurve, he actually coined the term several years ago. And kind of at a high level, it's just we know that there are all these different performance metrics that you can track, like start render or more recently, core web vitals like largest contentful paint or interaction to next paint and things like that. And so a performance budget is a threshold that you apply to any of those metrics that you decide on. And if your metric goes beyond that threshold, you get alerted somehow, and you know that something's broken and you need to fix it.
Okay, so that being said, I continue to see reports every year that say that page sizes are increasing. And I'm still seeing stories where the marketing department puts a, 10 meg GIF image across the page 3 different times. There's no caching, all of that stuff. So are we how do we get companies to understand how important putting these kind of guardrails and these practices in place, how that's going to actually help them along, not just about speed and performance, but about it crosses into dollars and cents, really. It's a financial impact as well. Can you talk about the impact and then how we get, I guess, to raise the awareness of this?
Yeah, I think so. When I talk with a lot of companies. I'm currently chief experience officer at SpeedCurve, so a big part of my job is meeting with our customers and talking about how they're tracking performance and what their concerns are and things like that. So it's really interesting because I get to learn a lot about what people are doing out in the real world. And the problem to me just seems to be an awareness problem. As soon as people understand what a performance budget is and that they have the capability of setting performance budgets and getting real time alerts, not just in Speaker, but in a handful of other tools as well that are in the same space. It's kind of a no brainer from there. Like people are on board with the idea. So I say awareness is the first issue. So once people have done that, then we're kind of fine. But to your point about page size and things like that, I think one of the problems that performance budget solves to me is exactly that. It's the fact that pages are increasingly complex. And with that complexity, every new resource that is introduced to a page that increases that complexity, that resource becomes a potential SPOF, a single point of failure for the page. So if we're looking at, kind of the median page right now, according to the HTTP archive, has, hundreds of different requests on it, JavaScript, images, things like that. All you need is one script that's render blocking or one script that's suffering from some kind of performance issue that day, maybe at the third party kind of side of things, or one image, one unoptimized image or video file that's non-performant, and it's going to push out all of your performance metrics. So having the ability to create performance budgets around things, even like not just time-based metrics like start render or largest contentful paint that I mentioned earlier, but around how the page is built so that oh, suddenly this page, which normally has, 400, um, you know, kilobytes of images, has 2 megs worth of images. Well, why? What happened? So you can set performance budgets against page-based metrics like page size and image weight and things like that. JavaScript size, all of those things that can be really, really helpful just to know that something's broken on your page.
You mentioned a few of these metrics. Can you talk about maybe some of the most important metrics that you use in performance budgets? I mean, there's tons of them, but what would be like your top three or four things that you always need to pay attention to and look at that make the biggest bang for the buck? I would say maybe.
So I'll lead with talking about Core Web Vitals because that's what everybody's talking about these days. So for the uninitiated, Core Web Vitals is a Google initiative to identify core metrics that most people should care about or everyone should care about if you care about Google's ability to rank your pages. So what I like about Core Web Vitals is that there are just three of them to start with. So, if, you know, of the scores and scores of performance metrics that are out there, it's really helpful for people who are just getting maybe new to performance to look at um, uh, just a very small number as opposed to being overwhelmed by a large number. The three core web vitals, the thing that makes them helpful too, is they kind of address different aspects of the user experience. So, largest contentful paint, which measures when the largest visual element in the browser renders, whether it's video or an image, kind of measures like, is the page responding? You know, is anything happening? Then you have, well, right now, first input delay, which is soon to be replaced by interaction in XPaint, which measures how responsive the JavaScript on your page is to user interaction. So that's measuring interactivity. And then cumulative layout shift, CLS, is a score-based metric, and it measures basically how janky the page feels as different elements shift around on the page. So it's kind of nice to have a set of three metrics like that. So because Google cares about those metrics, probably you care about wanting Google to like your pages so that you rank higher in Google search. You should care about those. But thinking beyond Google, because you have lots of users who are coming to your site who aren't using Google, and then there are other metrics that are measuring things for you as well. Like I love Start Render, and I know it's not new, it's not sexy, it's been around forever, but that's kind of one of the things that makes it really great. Is it is available? It's supported by every browser. You can measure it in synthetic tools, kind of so in your lab testing, but also in your RUM or kind of field tools, real user monitoring. So it's really nice to be able to measure both it in pretty much any tool that you have available to you. And then from a validation perspective, Start Render has been proven to correlate to business metrics like conversion rate or time on site. So we know that if your Start Render gets better or worse, that actually does have an impact on user behavior and on business. So it's a nice one to look at. And then there are also just the page composition metrics that I mentioned earlier, just kind of having some visibility into image weight, JavaScript weight, the number of render blocking scripts on your page, total page size, just to kind of understand like what's the baseline for how large your pages are, and is something happening to kind of push them beyond those bounds.
Awesome. So you've been talking about performance budgets for what, about 10 years now? I think that's when I found out about them. So, what would you say has been some of the biggest changes that have happened in how you're talking about performance budgets? Because, as you know, things have rapidly changed since that 10-year period. So, what would you say from then till now, the biggest changes, and what you're when you present about performance budget, what is the change in what you're saying about performance budget? What has changed the most?
Yeah, that's a really good question because things have changed a lot. When I first started talking about performance budgets many years ago, um, it was more the approach that I recommended to people, and I've walked back on this now, is to just to think about what your performance goals are. How fast do you want your pages to be, and your budget should just be like, well, for example, with Start Render. We want our Start Render to be 2 seconds. So therefore the performance budget is 2 seconds, and you want to know when you're slower than that. Um, Now, in recent years, we take a different approach, and this is actually based on I didn't come up with this practice. Harry Roberts, who people might know online on Twitter as CSS Wizardry, is a performance consultant, and I saw him do a talk at Perf Now a few years ago, and he recommended this practice, and I was like, oh my goodness, that's so much better. So he recommends a practice where you look at your data for a particular metric in a time series, and you look at the last 2 to 4 weeks worth of data, and you look at the worst day or the worst data point, and you make that your budget. And the idea there is that you're really kind of using performance budgets to fight regressions. So as you kind of move towards your performance goals, which is, a really important thing to want to do, what you're using your performance budget for is just to kind of keep you from getting slower. So you want to know and get alerted when it's like, oh no, like we introduced something that made things worse. So I would say that's kind of the most important change that I've seen in terms of the best practices around performance budgets in recent years.
Do you think we should give more grace to people on page size now that we think everybody has a much bigger, more bandwidth? They're all on 5G. We're assuming the word they've all got, gigabit internet to their house. Do you think that we should say, well, maybe it's okay to have a bigger web page today than it was 10, 15, 20 years ago? Or is there still a size that just says, you know what, you really should try to minimize it as much as you possibly can, no matter what?
That's a really good question. So there's no one answer to that question. It really depends on your site and who your users are. So if you're in a very kind of niche business, and you have rock solid knowledge of your user base, that bigger pages are, if that size is necessary, like for example you have to serve a lot of video because of that's just the way your users want to digest your content. um, that is what it is, and you're but at least you're going into it with some knowledge that you can justify why your page is so large. um, I would say for most other people, it's you pages are still too big, and I think we tend to cut ourselves too much slack. We tend to assume that kind of best world scenario, like everybody's got like a 5G connection, or they're at home on a fiber network, and they've got a newer device and all of those things. And maybe a lot of people do, but if you're even looking at like the 90th percentile, which I like to look at 90th percentiles in data a lot, and I'm not the only person who does this in the performance space, because medians are really deceptive. If you
Mm-hmm.
just focus on the median, and you use that as your goalpost, it's going to be really easy to satisfy yourself that you're doing a great job. If you
Right.
look at the 90th percentile, it's a very eye-opening experience where you see pages served at the 90th percentile are like 8 or 9 megs, and these are pages being served to mobile. If you look at recent HTTP archive data, and just the performance impact of those large pages, and the really slow rendering times. And 90th percentile sounds like, oh, it's just the edge, it's a long tail. But if you think about, like, you're serving 1 out of 10 of your users a really terrible experience, that's a lot of users. If you scale that up to, if you 20 or 40 million visitors a month to your properties. So I think that we do tend to be a little bit too easy on ourselves. Um, just as a little side note, there's a really excellent blog series by Alex Russell called The Performance Inequality Gap, where he actually looks at worldwide, like global stats around browser usage and device types, and just kind of talks about the fact that as a certain part of the world, which we're very lucky to be part of, kind of surges ahead in terms of what we have, our kind of tech privilege, I guess. um, we're leaving a big chunk of the world behind that's using different devices in different contexts. And Alex, in one of the posts, makes some recommendations that are actually specifically around page size, where he suggests that the typical page only be something like 150 kilobytes of HTML, CSS, images, and fonts,
Mm-hmm.
and no more than 350 kilobytes of JavaScript. I rarely see pages that are that small. But if you think of your site as having a global audience, Alex has done the work, and he's looked at the numbers. And if this is what he's recommending, I think there's a lot of validity to this.
And when you said 150K page size, I saw all the developers watching the show made a frowny face as soon as you did that. How is that even possible? you know, no.
And here's like the other thing that I would say is it's kind of like, don't let perfect be the enemy of good.
Hmm.
So I would hate for somebody to see those targets. And this is kind of what I was talking about earlier about the difference between a budget and a goal, is don't let those targets scare you away from trying. You might not be able to get down to that because, if you're a media site in 2023, there's no way you're going to get rid of all of the third parties on your pages. You need them. They're part of how your site does business. It's how you monetize your content. But it's really kind of to help you think, if you have budget and these numbers in mind, and you believe in the reasoning behind them, you can use that reasoning to kind of help you make some calls about what really needs to be on the page. And if you have to have all of these resources on your page, to be really mindful of um, you know the idea of the critical rendering path. So when we talk about the critical rendering path, we're talking about all of the resources that have to render to deliver to the user what looks like a usable page. And there's a lot of stuff that, like, when I see sites that appear slow, it's really just they've got a lot of things in that critical rendering path that don't need to be there, like scripts and images that could be deferred, things like that. So try to make at least that critical rendering path as lean and efficient as possible. And you could be doing a lot to help people just with that.
Yep, agree. And those 14 marketing tracker things that you're putting on every page, you might want to, scale down just a little bit. Um, Getting back to my earlier question about, or when I was discussing that this actually does impact the bottom line, this has a financial impact. We've all got war stories, but can you name a specific instance where somebody did apply a performance budget and it made this huge impact for them and for their company? And you don't have to specify the company or anything, but can you think of a great story around this?
I'm going to be fuzzy on the numbers because it was a few years ago, but one that comes to mind is I co-presented with a U.S. retailer called Fanatics. They sell specialized sportswear, like team jerseys and things like that. And so they have quite a large customer base, and they do a lot of business, especially around like big sporting events like the Super Bowl and things like that. And they did had some kind of budget in place where they discovered that they were serving some really large images, especially to mobile. And so, because the budget captured that and they were able to fix it, and it was just in time for some major sporting event. They actually saw the needle move like immediately on conversions when they did that. So I thought that was a really interesting little case study there. If you go to, I can send you the link for this as well, Scott, but
Mm-hmm.
WPOstats.com. It's just a repository of case studies around performance, and not just about how people made their site faster, but also how, in doing so, they helped user experience in a measurable way, like bounce rate, or they increase their conversion rate or improve their search ranking, things like that. So it's a really good repository of case studies.
I think that's key. I think every performance engineer needs to have that site bookmarked and be ready to share at any given meeting, because there's always this tendency to think that, well, us performance engineers, you just want to make things fast. No, it's not just about being fast. We're trying to help you. We're really trying to help you. Many people don't like to go to the dentist, but afterwards they're probably glad that they did. We're trying to make things better for you. I love the fact that your background, you come from the UX side and from the user side, because I got to tell you, of all the years I've been doing this, it really all boils down to what is that user experiencing on their screen and how can you make that experience the best for everybody. When you do that, it's complete win. If you dive into the details of how do I create a load test and write great code for a load testing script, or how do I build this great dashboard that shows me, you get caught into all those technical details, you lose the fact of why we're actually trying to do this, which is to make things better for everybody. And it seems like you have that at front of mind all the time, which I think is awesome. So,
Thanks.
um,
Yeah, it's the most interesting part of all of this for me is just sort of like, if you're making things faster and it's not affecting user behavior, then that's, to me, it sort of triggers a question of why. And there's actually an interesting concept that your listeners might be interested in called the performance plateau, where it's kind of addressing this question of like, well, we made our pages faster. We, across the board, we improved start render from, 5 seconds to 3 seconds. And we didn't see a change in user behavior. Why is that? And people can get discouraged when they look at that. But if you actually map, if you look at your RUM data, your real user data, and you map your performance metrics against your business metrics or your user engagement metrics like bounce rate, and you create it's I'm gonna give I'm just trying to draw a chart in the air. This is really silly, but if you do that, what I've observed is something called the performance plateau, where user behavior doesn't change necessarily just because you made things 2 seconds faster if you didn't get off that plateau. So for your users, for example, maybe the needle doesn't change until you start serving them pages that have a start render of under 2 seconds. So there's this often a fairly long performance plateau that starts at like 2 or 3 seconds and carries on, and people can get really discouraged if they don't know that that exists, and they can
Mhm.
think like, well, actually our users don't care about performance, so why even bother trying? So that's kind of just this can be something that affects your performance budgets or your performance goals, is to basically, to once you know what your performance plateau is and where that plateau starts for your company or your site, to make your performance goal kind of to move as many of your users into that cohort of getting like sub 2 second start renders as possible.
Right.
So I
That's
think,
awesome.
yeah, I think for people, whatever you do in your org, having some type of correlation chart that shows you how what you do helps the business and helps your users, I think that is very, very motivating.
Well, it presents the value that you really provide. I'm not just a scripter. I'm not just a metrics person. I'm actually helping the business in context. And I think that makes the biggest difference. So, if now we've sold people on the concept of doing a performance budget that have not done it before. If they want to know more information about this, where can they go to kind of dive a little deeper about this?
Yeah, so I've written a fair bit about performance budgets. I have a blog post. It's just basically a guide that talks about like these are some metrics you can track, and these are some ways you can set goals and things like that. So you can find me on Twitter. I'm always happy to talk about performance budgets. I've been talking about them for a long time, and I'll probably be talking about them for a long time more. So you can find me on Twitter and Mastodon, just Tammy Everts. I think I'm pretty easy to find. LinkedIn as well, so we can chat more.
Sounds great. Well, thank you again so much for being on today's program. It was great, and you're welcome to come back on anytime you have anything to say.
Thank you so much. This was really fun. Thanks for letting me come on.
Okay. Wow, great having Tammy on the program today. I want to show you the website for the guide that Tammy mentioned that she had written up. And as of the recording of this show, this was only a few weeks old, so it's fairly updated. A complete guide to performance budgets. It's on the Speed Curve website, and it basically goes through all the basics of what we talked about, and then it actually talks about the kind of metrics that you'll want to look at, how to set this up, and you can use Speed Curve. There are other things that you could actually look at. She mentions about them being a goal or a for aspirational purposes or practical purposes. And this is one of the things she was talking about, how things have actually changed. Because just because you might fail or quote unquote fail your initial budget, it doesn't mean that the website is actually a fail. It may just be something you're aspiring to achieve, and how well you achieve that is up to changes and tweaks that you make in your application. But I think this is a great thing, and if you're not doing it now, you've been educated. You're now responsible for the information. You should be doing it. But you know what? You have the right to disagree, which is where your feedback comes into play. I'd really like to hear from you about this topic. Have you set up a performance budget? And if so, how has it been for you? Have you seen more conversion? Has it impacted your bottom line? Or do you say, you know what, we don't need performance budgets because of I'd like to know what you think about that. I can be reached on most social media platforms, but if you'll scan that QR code, it'll take you to a bio page. It'll tell you how to get in touch with me, or you can leave your feedback for me on email, sending me an email to heyscott@smcjournal.com. Would love to hear what you think about this. Like this content, would be great if you like this video and subscribed to our YouTube channel. There's the URL for the channel, and a QR code will take you directly to the page. And it would be great if you help me train that wonderful YouTube algorithm that we are actually a tech show and that more people should know about it. That would be great. Until the next SMC Journal podcast, Scott Moore thanking you again for watching, and we'll see you next time. Bye-bye.